Ships to the Americas. Were Black people already here? The history they don't want us to question. For generations, we've been told a version of history that begins with suffering. We've been told that Black people, our ancestors, were stolen from the shores of Africa, crammed into the belly of slave ships, and shipped off like cargo to a foreign land where they were forced to labor under the whip. This is the story we are given, the one we are told to accept without question. But what if that's not the whole truth? What if I told you that Black people were already in the Americas before Columbus ever set foot on this land? What if I told you that the story of the transatlantic slave trade, while real, has been twisted and manipulated to make us forget that we were here first? We are expected to believe that millions of Africans were packed onto ships, transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions, and then somehow, despite all of that, there are almost no official records of their arrival. No names, no real ship logs, no consistent documentation like the ones kept for European immigrants. Meanwhile, European migration, whether it was the Mayflower, the Irish coming through Ellis Island, or Italians arriving on steamships, is perfectly documented. We can trace European families back to the very ships they arrived on. But when we ask, where are the ship records for Black people? History gives us silence. They tell us that our history begins with slavery, but never want us to ask, what was our history before that? Why is it that we have no solid evidence of millions of Africans being checked in upon arrival, but we have countless records of Europeans? Why do we accept a version of history that begins with chains, rather than one that acknowledges that we may have already been here, living, thriving, and existing long before European ships ever crossed the ocean? We've been taught a Eurocentric lie, one that makes us believe that we are permanent outsiders to this land, when, in reality, our ancestors may have been its original inhabitants. Today, we challenge everything we've been told. Today, we ask the questions that history books refuse to answer. This is Ships to the Americas. Were Black people already here? And this time, we're not settling for the stories they want us to believe. We're searching for the truth. Before we go any further, I need you to do one thing. This conversation is too important to be ignored, buried, or dismissed. If you believe in seeking truth over accepting lies, if you believe that history should be told from our perspective, not just theirs, then I need you to support this discussion in every way you can. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this topic matters and that more people need to hear it. Subscribe to my channel, Life Points with Rhonda 2968. Because conversations like this don't happen in mainstream spaces. We have to create them for ourselves. Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Black people were already in America before the transatlantic slave trade? Have you ever questioned the official narrative? Let's talk about it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this, because when we start asking the right questions, we force history to answer. They've controlled the narrative for too long. It's time to reclaim our truth. Welcome back to Life Points with Rhonda, the podcast where we discuss life, love, relationships, and everything in between. I am your host, Rhonda, and as always, I am so honored that you've chosen to spend this time with me today. Now you know that on this podcast, We don't just scratch the surface. We dig deep. We ask the hard questions. We challenge the narratives that have been fed to us for generations. And today is no different. This episode is not just a discussion, it's an investigation, a reclamation of history, a journey into the truth about who we are, where we come from, and how our presence in the Americas may have been deliberately misrepresented. We've been told that Black people came to America, but when we start looking for actual records, passenger lists, names, processing documents like the ones that exist for European immigrants, they are nowhere to be found. That raises a question that many of us were never encouraged to ask. Were Black people already in America before slavery? That's what we're going to explore today. But before we begin, I want to remind you, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, share this episode, and follow me on all platforms, Life Points with Rhonda. If this conversation resonates with you, drop a comment, start a discussion, and let's keep this energy going beyond just this episode. All right, let's get into it. The evidence of Black people in the Americas before Columbus. For centuries, we have been told that Black people arrived in the Americas only as enslaved Africans, shackled in the hulls of slave ships, stripped of their identities, and forced into a life of bondage. But when we begin questioning the narrative, when we start looking beyond what we were taught in school, we find evidence that suggests something very different. What if Black people were already here before Columbus? What if our presence in the Americas did not start with slavery, but instead with sovereignty, culture, and civilization? To answer these questions, we have to look at history before Columbus, before 1492, before the Transatlantic slave trade, before the European colonization of the so-called New World. The first thing we must understand is that the history we are told is written from a Eurocentric perspective. European colonizers shaped the narrative to benefit themselves, and in doing so, they erased, altered, and manipulated the truth about who was already in the Americas before they arrived. But despite their best efforts, the evidence is still here, and it speaks louder than the lies. Ancient Black presence in the Americas. What the artifacts tell us. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that Black people were in the Americas before Columbus is found in the Olmec civilization of ancient Mexico. The Olmecs, who thrived from 1500 BCE to 400 BCE, left behind massive stone sculptures, colossal heads, some as large as 10 feet tall and weighing up to 40 tons. These heads depict figures with broad noses, full lips, and facial features that strongly resemble West African people. But how did these African features appear in an ancient American civilization that existed thousands of years before the transatlantic slave trade? Mainstream historians dismiss this, claiming that the Olmecs were simply indigenous Americans with similar features. But many researchers argue that these sculptures prove an African presence in the Americas long before Columbus or European contact. This isn't just about a single set of statues. It's about a pattern of evidence that challenges the narrative. African artifacts, textiles, and symbols have been found in ancient American ruins, showing striking similarities to those in West Africa. Ancient American cultures, including the Olmecs and the Mayans, used hieroglyphic writing systems that resemble African scripts. Linguistic evidence suggests that some indigenous languages in the Americas have connections to African dialects. If all of this is coincidence, then it's a very big coincidence. Pre-Columbian African voyages. Did Africans sail to the Americas first? Another piece of the puzzle is the possibility that Africans sailed to the Americas long before Europeans ever knew this land existed. The idea that Africans could have reached the Americas on their own is not far-fetched. In fact, we know that ancient African civilizations, particularly in Mali and Egypt, had advanced seafaring technology. Egyptian boats, some dating back to 3000 BCE, were capable of long ocean voyages. Historical records suggest that Malian Emperor Abubakar II set sail with a fleet of 2,000 ships across the Atlantic in the early 1300s, nearly 200 years before Columbus. Even Columbus himself wrote in his journals that when he arrived in the Americas, he saw dark-skinned people who resembled Africans already living there. If Africans were already here before Columbus, it means that not all Black people in the Americas came from slave ships. Some were indigenous to this land, but their identities were erased. European colonizers had a motive to hide this truth because it meant that Black people were not foreigners, but rightful inheritors of the land. The erasure of Black Indigenous identity. So, if Black people were already in the Americas, what happened? Why aren't we taught this in history books? Why is the only story we hear about our origins the one that begins with us in chains? The answer is systematic, historical erasure. When European colonizers arrived, they needed to justify stealing land from the people who were already here. Instead of acknowledging Black indigenous populations, they classified them as Negroes and forced them into the same narrative as African captives. Laws were created to strip Black people of their native identity, ensuring that they had no legal claim to land, no recognition as indigenous, and no history outside of slavery. This is why today many Black people have indigenous ancestry, but no official connection to their tribes. It is why Native American history and Black history are kept separate, even though they were deeply intertwined. And it is why, when we look for ship records, we don't find them, because we were not all brought here. Many of us were already here. Why did they change the narrative? Now that we've established the strong evidence that Black people were already present in the Americas before Columbus, the next question we need to ask is, why did they erase this history? Why did they want us to believe that our only connection to this land begins with slavery, chains, and suffering? The answer is simple. Control, power, land, wealth, the European colonization agenda, erasing indigenous Black identity. From the moment European colonizers arrived in the Americas, they had one goal: domination. They didn't come here to share, to integrate, or to respect the civilizations that were already thriving. They came here to conquer, and the only way they could justify their theft of land and resources was by making the world believe that the land was empty, that the people here were uncivilized and that they had no rightful claim to it. This is why the European colonization narrative always emphasizes the idea that Native Americans were scattered, weak, and easily overpowered, because it makes conquest seem inevitable and justified. But when we add Black Indigenous people into the picture, things get even more complicated. If Black people were already in the Americas before Columbus, then they were not immigrants or slaves. They were the original people of the land. They had civilizations, societies, and cultural roots here that predated European contact. They had a rightful claim to the land that colonizers were trying to steal. This was a problem for the European powers. How could they justify taking land from people who already lived here? The creation of the slave ship narrative. To erase Black Indigenous identity, Europeans had to reclassify and redefine who we were. This is when they began shifting the narrative, turning Black Indigenous people into Africans and making sure that our history started with slavery, not with sovereignty. They reclassified Black Indigenous people as Negroes. Instead of acknowledging them as native to the land, they grouped them with enslaved Africans and stripped them of their tribal identities. They made sure Black people were taught that they came from Africa and had no prior history in the Americas. This way, we wouldn't question why we had no connection to our indigenous roots. They created laws that legally separated Black people from Native American identity. The one-drop rule was enforced to classify anyone with African ancestry as Black, erasing their Native heritage. This ensured that Black people would never see themselves as indigenous or as the rightful heirs to the land. Instead, they were taught to believe that they were outsiders, foreigners, people who had been brought here instead of people who had always been here. The role of government, education, and media in historical erasure. The erasure of Black Indigenous identity was not random. It was deliberate and systematic, carried out through government policies, education, and the media. U.S. government records. The government created federal policies that erased Black Native American identity. In the 1800s, laws were passed that removed Black people from tribal roles and reclassified them as just Negro or colored. School curriculums, history books were designed to separate Black and Native identities, making sure that Black children only learned about slavery and oppression, while Native American children were taught their history in isolation. Hollywood and the media, the entertainment industry reinforced the idea that Native Americans were always light-skinned, with straight hair, while Black people had no connection to the land outside of slavery. These efforts were not about telling the truth. They were about controlling history and making sure Black people never saw themselves as more than just descendants of slaves. Because here's the truth. A people disconnected from their roots is a people easier to control. If we don't know where we come from, we won't know what belongs to us. We won't know what was stolen, and we won't fight to reclaim it. The psychological impact of the narrative shift is profound. By forcing Black people to believe that we only came here on slave ships, colonizers ensured that we would feel disconnected from the land. If we think we're just visitors in America, we won't claim it as ours. Accepting oppression as our history becomes easier. If we only associate our past with slavery, we won't realize that we were once rulers, warriors, and builders of great civilizations. This leads us to see ourselves as powerless. If our history starts with us being dominated, we'll believe that we were always meant to be dominated. This is why the transatlantic slave trade narrative was so heavily pushed, while the truth about Black Indigenous identity was buried. When we put the pieces together, the picture becomes clear. Black people were already in the Americas before Columbus. Colonizers erased their identity to steal land and resources. The transatlantic slave trade narrative was used as a tool to separate Black people from their indigenous heritage. By keeping us disconnected from our real history, they ensured that we would never challenge the system they built on our backs. But now we know. And once you know the truth, you can never unsee it. Now that we've uncovered the truth, that Black people were present in the Americas long before Columbus, and that our indigenous identities were erased to justify colonization, the next question is, what do we do with this knowledge? This is more than just a history lesson. This is about identity, power, and reclamation. If Black people were not just enslaved, Africans brought here on ships, but also the original inhabitants of the land, then that means we are not outsiders in America. We didn't just arrive here through slavery. We were always here. We have a rightful claim to this land. The idea that Black people have no homeland outside of Africa is false. Our indigenous culture has been hidden from us. Much of what we see as African American culture may, in fact, be remnants of our true indigenous heritage. The consequences of this hidden history are profound. For generations, Black people in America have been conditioned to believe that we do not belong here, that we were brought here against our will, and that America was never meant to be ours. That lie has created a deep-rooted psychological effect, disconnection from the land. We are told to view ourselves as permanent visitors in a country that our ancestors may have actually built from the ground up. Disconnection from heritage, our traditions, customs, and spiritual beliefs were erased, replaced with a history of oppression rather than a history of sovereignty. Disconnection from power. When people believe they have no roots, they have no foundation. And without a foundation, it is easier to keep us in a state of disenfranchisement and disempowerment. But what happens when we realize the truth? We begin to see that we were not just victims of history. We were the architects of civilization. The erasure of Black Indigenous tribes. Another major consequence of this historical manipulation is that many Indigenous Black tribes were stripped of their identity and reclassified. For example, the Yamasee, Washita, and Black Seminoles were powerful indigenous groups with deep roots in America, but many of their descendants today are labeled simply as African American instead of indigenous. The Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek nations had Black members who were later removed from tribal roles due to government interference. Census records and government documents purposely reclassified Native Black people as Negro or colored instead of recognizing their indigenous heritage. The goal was to ensure that Black people could never lay claim to Native land, resources, or heritage. The myth that Black people have no land. One of the biggest lies that has been pushed on Black people is the idea that we are the only group of people with no true homeland. They tell us Africans were stolen from their land and scattered. African Americans have no place to return to because they are descendants of slaves. America was never ours. We were just brought here. But if we were already here before slavery, then America is just as much our land as it is anyone else's. This is why we see so many cases of Black towns, Black landowners, and Black farmers mysteriously losing their property throughout history. The destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. The flooding of Black towns like Oscarville, Georgia, now Lake Lanier. The mysterious disappearances of Black-owned land across the South. If Black people were truly foreigners in America, then why were so many of our ancestors, landowners, business owners, and community builders before segregation, before Jim Crow, and before modern-day gentrification pushed us out? Because the truth is, we were never meant to be landless. We were made landless. Connecting the dots, the transatlantic slave trade, and the true origins of Black Americans. It is Black History Month, and that means it is time to go deeper than the surface level stories we were taught in school. It's time to question, to investigate, and to reclaim the truth that was stolen from us. We have already uncovered the reality that Black people were in the Americas before Columbus, that our indigenous identities were erased, and that the narrative of the transatlantic slave trade was used to disconnect us from our rightful land. But the biggest question still remains. If we were already here, then why did they push the story that we were brought here on slave ships? This is where we connect the final dots, where we expose how the transatlantic slave trade was used not just to enslave Africans, but to erase Black indigenous people who were already in America. Let's start with the math of the transatlantic slave trade. We have been told that millions of Africans were kidnapped, placed on slave ships, and brought to North America. But here's the problem. Out of the estimated 12.5 million enslaved Africans taken from the continent, only about 388,000 were documented as arriving in what is now the United States. The vast majority of enslaved Africans were actually taken to South America and the Caribbean, not North America. Yet, today, African Americans make up over 40 million people in the U.S. So, how did a few 100,000 enslaved people multiply into over 40 million? The answer is simple. Not all Black people in America came from Africa. Many were already here. If the numbers don't add up, it means that the history we've been given is incomplete, and we need to start asking why. One of the most damaging and intentional lies in history was the legal reclassification of indigenous Black people in America as Negroes and later as African Americans. Many Black Indigenous people were never on slave ships, but they were enslaved anyway. To justify this, colonizers and the U.S. government deliberately changed census records, birth certificates, and legal documents to erase Native identity from Black people. Black Native tribes, like the Washita, Yamasee, and Black Seminoles, were not counted as Native, but instead as Negro or colored. Over time, the narrative was repeated so much that even Black people believed it. This was a form of cultural genocide, a way to ensure that Indigenous Black people had no claim to land, no connection to their heritage, and no legal status outside of slavery. DNA evidence and the mixed origins of Black Americans. Today, we have access to DNA technology that allows us to trace our origins. And what we are finding is something that challenges the mainstream narrative. Many African Americans who take ancestry tests find that they have significant Native American DNA. They have traces of DNA from other places besides West Africa. Some have lineages that do not match what we were taught about African ancestry. While some of this can be attributed to mixing over generations, it also points to a deeper truth. Our people were already here, and our genetic ties prove it. Reclaiming our true history and identity. Now that we see how the pieces fit together, it is time to reclaim what was taken from us. Educate yourself and question the narrative. Read about Black Indigenous history, look at historical maps, and study the tribes that were erased from official records. Look at your own family history. Many Black families have stories of Native ancestry that were ignored or dismissed. It's time to explore them. Stop accepting the idea that we came here in chains. Yes, many Africans were enslaved, but that is not our only origin story. We need to stop limiting our identity to what colonizers have told us. Spread this knowledge. The more people know the truth, the harder it becomes for the lies to continue. This Black History Month, let's go beyond the surface. Let's stop starting our history at slavery. Let's stop believing that we were just brought here when we may have been here all along. Because knowing the truth is power. And once you know who you really are, nobody can take that power away. For centuries, history books have told us a one-sided story, a version of events that starts our history in chains that erases our legacy and that disconnects us from our rightful land. But now we are uncovering the truth. We now know that Black people were in the Americas before Columbus. Our ancestors were not all brought here. They were already here, thriving in civilizations that predated European colonization. The transatlantic slave trade was real, but it was also used to rewrite history. Millions of Africans were enslaved, but many Black people who were already in America were simply reclassified as Negroes and stripped of their indigenous status. The missing slave ship records make sense when we understand that not all Black people came on ships. The reason we don't see millions of documented African arrivals in America is because many of us never arrived. We were already here. The erasure of Black Indigenous history was intentional. Colonizers used government policies, census records, school curriculums, and media propaganda to hide the truth and ensure that Black people never saw themselves as indigenous to this land. Now that we understand the truth, we need to change the way we see ourselves and our history. For too long, we have accepted the narrative that we are foreigners in America, that we were brought here, that we have no land to claim outside of Africa. That ends today. We were always here. We are not outsiders. We are not just descendants of slaves. We are descendants of indigenous people whose history was stolen. This means we have the right to reconnect with our indigenous identity. Many of our customs, traditions, and even our spiritual practices have been passed down. We just didn't realize they were indigenous. We must stop accepting history as it is given to us. Every time you hear a version of history that only starts with slavery, challenge it. Ask the hard questions. Seek the real answers. We must reclaim ownership of our history, our land, and our communities. The biggest threat to the system is Black people who understand their true power. That is why our history was stolen in the first place. Every Black History Month, we are told to celebrate the same stories. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman. And while these figures deserve honor, why do they only ever tell us about our history after slavery? Why don't they teach us about the Black Indigenous civilizations that existed before 1492? Why don't they want us to know that we were not just enslaved, but that we were rulers, landowners, warriors, and builders long before Europeans ever arrived? This Black History Month, let's do something different. Let's stop limiting our history to oppression. Let's stop starting our story in chains. Let's reclaim the full truth. Because we were never meant to be lost. We were made lost. And now we are finding our way back. Now that you have this knowledge, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Let's spread the truth that has been buried for too long. Subscribe to Life Points with Rhonda 2968 on YouTube. I will continue diving into the topics that history books don't want us to discuss. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. Our Life Points with Rhonda. If you want more content that challenges the narrative and seeks truth, let's stay connected. Drop a comment and join the conversation. Have you ever questioned the history of Black people in America? Let's talk about it. The more we learn, the harder it becomes for them to hide the truth. This is Black history. This is our history. And it is time to reclaim it. Thank you for watching. If you found value in today's video, I invite you to take your journey even further with my podcast, Life Points with Rhonda, where we dive deep into relationships, personal growth, and the wisdom that helps you thrive. Tune in on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all major streaming platforms for powerful insights that can transform your life. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more uplifting content like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Stay connected with me on Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. Life Points with Rhonda. Visit my website at lifepointswithrhonda.com for exclusive content, coaching, and more. Thank you for your support. Until next time, take care and stay phenomenal.